You're listening to the Bitcoin Lawyer Podcast.
All right, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Bitcoin Lawyer Podcast. Today, I am joined by David Lesperance. He is a prolific writer and attorney in the world of citizenship by investment, tax, and everything in that field. Welcome to the show, David.
It's my pleasure, Adam.
So, David, I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about a few topics, okay? I wanted to dive into there's a few things that we talk about on this podcast. We talk about citizenship by investment, Bitcoin, and the law, and sort of the crossroads of all of those fields. So, when looking at your profile, I became aware of you. I met Eric Major about a year ago, right around this time when I was at law school, the University of Malta. And there was a podcast I think you guys did together that I came across. And I was just very, very impressed by a lot of the writings that you've done and just sort of the eclectic topics you've covered. So I was wondering if you could just kind of give our listeners just quick backstory about the origins of your practice and where they started and where they currently are now in the CBI world.
Sure. I am a Canadian, born and raised in Windsor, Ontario, child of the auto industry. My father would wake up in Canada and go work in the US every day. And what was quite common back in the day, because it's only a kilometer across the river, is when mothers would feel the contractions, they'd run over to Henry Ford Hospital and have what they now call anchor babies. My parents were Rh blood incompatible, which was an issue back then. Doesn't affect the first two, but I was number three. So when she got pregnant with me and then my younger sister, her doctor said, "Don't be screwing around driving across the bridge. You have that kid in Canada. It's going to need blood transfusions." So I've been watching the American experience, as PBS would say, for all of my life. I'm not claiming to be de Tocqueville, but I have been following this for my entire life. There was that part of my background. Yeah.
To see how many of our listeners will actually get that reference that you made. But anyways, we'll move on. We'll let the slow kids catch up. So sorry, go ahead.
No problem. If you look at my resume, it looks quite Machiavellian, but it was circumstance. I needed a job. My father was implementing the auto pack for GM Canada. Got me a job working at Canada Customs at the busiest car entry, the Windsor-Detroit Tunnel. Couple of days of sweating it out in my little booth, seeing the immigration people in an air-conditioned office reading the newspaper. I thought that would be the job for me. And then we moved to Toronto, and I started working at Toronto International, Pearson Airport. Again, just a great gig going through law school. Got called to the bar in 1990. My law school study partner went to work for Baker McKenzie in Hong Kong. So he was feeding me all the clients prior to the handover. So I've been dealing with Asian clients for 3.5 decades. Then Canada had a golden visa program back then, the immigrant investor program. So I was running up and down the Gulf. This is Tuesday, must be Bahrain, meeting all the private banking clients for Standard Chartered Bank and British Bank of the Middle East, which was HSBC. And I did my first expatriation in 1990. I had a fellow who told me he had gotten citizenship in this place called St. Kitts and Nevis, which I knew was in the Caribbean, but which I confess I had to pull out an atlas to see exactly where it was. And we did this nice little thing where he was a Detroit area lawyer. We moved him to Canada. We expatriated them. This was prior to the mark to market. It was the 10-year rule days. We brought him into Canada. Canada had a trust, so he didn't pay tax on anything he already had prior to coming in and set up in a trust. He made his money in the U.S. We got him a O visa.
Okay.
So he could cross the border and work. He paid on that U.S. source, put the net proceed into the trust, earning tax-free, paid the delta between Canada and U.S. tax, but he never was a U.S. person because he would commute every day from a contiguous territory. So he never ranked up the days on the substantial presence. So it was pretty complex. And it brought me into the world of the tax lawyers who were doing expatriation very early on. But I thought, this is a pretty specific tax or pretty specific scenario. How often am I going to get these?
If I can interrupt real quick, I actually just had a quick legal question because it piqued my interest. So I grew up in California. Mexico was about 6 hour drive south. You never needed a passport or an ID to cross the border back in those days. Basically, you just show up, walk across. And you can I think until just recently, you could drive your car into Mexico and they weren't enforcing the FFM requirements. But I wanted to ask, you mentioned you mentioned the,
Contiguous territory.
okay, contiguous territory. Can you explain to our listeners how that works? This I've never heard of.
Sure. You are a U.S. person for tax purposes if you're one of three things: a citizen, a green card holder, or you spend too much time in the United States and you trigger something called the substantial presence test. The question is, which days count? So if you're entering the United States from a contiguous territory, Mexico or Canada, for the purpose of attending employment in the United States, that day doesn't count. So he would wake up in the morning. He could actually get to his Detroit area office faster from Windsor than he could from suburban Detroit. That day didn't count. So long as he came back before midnight of the following day, neither of those days would count. So he commuted every day. And so he never accumulated, even though he was physically present in the US, those days he never got to the substantial presence test.
Okay, got it. Wow, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware that there was sort of loophole, but I mean that there was that caveat, if you will. I just always assumed if you cross the border, you're entering the country because a normal entry is flight or by boat, that kind of thing, through like a
Mhm.
cruise, that sort of thing. That at like a port of entry that counted as a day of entering the country. But okay, interesting.
Yeah, if you look at the substantial presence test, there's a couple of exemptions. We call this the Cinderella days, leave before midnight. But also, if you're compelled to appear at a civil or criminal trial, those days do not count. If you have a medical emergency that arises while you're in the United States, and so you can't leave, those days account. It's all in the IRC, the Internal Revenue Code, as to what the exemption days are under the substantial presence test.
Okay. But I did want to ask that question because I've never heard of that exemption or that there were sort of divergence from what you would normally consider an entry to the country. But, okay. Um, I'm sorry. You were talking about wanting to move from the booth into the air conditioning while at Toronto International.
Right. So that was very good. When I got called to the bar, I had experience as the person at the other end of the desk. So I call myself either a tax savvy immigration advisor or an immigration savvy tax advisor.
Okay.
So, because tax is so important for, again, the higher net worth clients, we want to, if we're going to, for example, do an expatriation, we don't want them jumping out of the US tax pot and into somebody else's tax fire. So, we look at kind of where they're going to be. And it's not only from the US. You can leave the US, you can renounce your US citizenship. You are not obligated to establish a residence in another jurisdiction. If, from a lifestyle point of view, you gallivant around and never spend enough time to become tax resident anywhere else, you could, in effect, be tax resident nowhere. Other countries, for example, Canada, says we don't consider you to have left until you establish ties somewhere else. So if you get in a boat and sail around the world, even though you don't spend time in Canada, Canada still considers you tax resident.
Got it. Okay. I appreciate you clarifying that. Okay. So let's get into this a little bit. So, when you started your law practice, I think you were mentioning at the point before the handover from the British to the Chinese of Hong Kong, and Canada had its investor program. I had a conversation with Eric during our podcast interview, and he basically was giving me a whole history lesson about how Canada started the CBI. Well, I guess not CBI, but it would basically be residency by investment. Um, which eventually could lead to citizenship. But would you consider Canada sort of pioneering that model that other countries have used for their CBI programs?
Yes, so Canada had this type of program. There was some CBI programs, for example, Belize was an early one. Cape Verde had a program in the late 80s, but the kind of major developed country, Canada. And so if you look around in the industry, kind of the OGs like Eric and I, Nuri Katz and Hayek, and a number of the kind of these names are Canadians because we started out in this. The problem was we quickly realized we needed more than Canada as a tool in our toolbox because ministers would come and go, program would change, things would slow down. So you needed to have more than just Canada as a solution. The other part of my background, Adam, I always have to preface this disclosure with I swear my siblings and I didn't go out night clubbing looking for Europeans to dance with. But my sister married a Latvian, my brother married an Italian, I married a Scotswoman, then a Pole, and my younger sister married an Irishman. So I've been doing lineage citizenships since before I got called to the bar.
Wow, that's
Um,
interesting. Okay.
and so that's an interesting part of the background. That's another tool in the toolbox that people may have depending on what their specific family history is.
That's really interesting in terms of doing CBI. So let's jump into a little bit of how cryptocurrency plays into this, because I definitely see that this is an emerging market, and I know that you've written quite a few articles about this. I actually was reading um and I'm not going to quote you, but I was reading this is from an article from May of 2022 that you wrote. It's called Beyond Satoshi Island Citizenships.
Mhm.
And you mentioned Do Kwon and Sam Bankman Fried, who were both under investigation at that point. And I just came across this article and I thought, wow, that has not aged well for either of these two individuals. I know that Do Kwon was in Montenegro and was caught there on a forged Costa Rican passport, if I believe.
Yes.
And then finally was extradited to the US, if I'm correct. Because I know for a while he and the US and South Korea were fighting it out to see where he would actually be extradited to. If we're looking at the scope of cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and I always do distinguish between the two just for the sake of Bitcoin having so many different properties than the rest of cryptocurrency. My definition is I see Bitcoin and then I see all other cryptocurrencies as two different sets. But what role would you see cryptocurrency and or Bitcoin playing in the citizenship by investment world today?
Well, that article was really talking about how somebody who's a founder, those would be founders, in an emerging technology should protect themselves. And I was drawing upon my experience from the mid 2000s of dealing with a lot of offshore or online gaming and sports books. So I got involved in those programs. If you can remember back in 2005 and 2006, a lot of those companies were going public on the UK market, the FTSE. And so I was called into planning meetings, and a lot of those founders were American and who were interested in expatriating, like anybody who would want to before a big liquidity event for tax purposes. Well, that emergent technology at first, the mainstream casino industry said, well, internet's not really going to be a big deal. All of a sudden, it became a big deal. And Vegas and Macau were saying, these guys are eating our lunch. So what can we do? Well, we have muscle, political muscle. We can have local legislatures, particularly in the US and state level, change various laws to make various aspects of that business illegal. And they arrested a British, actually, CEO who was en route between London, where he had a shareholders meeting, and Costa Rica, where their offices were. I think it was Dallas, Fort Worth, he flew through. And they arrested him. And what they really wanted was leverage over the company. We used to call this doing an Elliot Spitzer. For those in the audience who remember Elliot Spitzer, he was at one point the Attorney General, sorry, he was the
No, he was the Southern District.
Southern District of New York.
Yeah, that's right.
And the Sheriff of Wall Street. And Elliot Spitzer's particular technique was, I don't know if I have much of a case, but I'm going to arrest the CEO. I'm going to call up the board a couple hours before the market opens and say, let's make a deal. And he did that quite successfully until he took on AIG, and that CEO said, I have money, I'm going to fight it, and won that case. Elliot lost. And then Elliot went on to self-destruct in other ways. So I said to these clients, well, don't go to the US. I mean, I had a client who said, look, if I walk on a football pitch in the UK, I get applauded. If I fly through Newark, I get arrested. What should we do? I said, well, the UK is a place which has a very deep bench with regards to extradition lawyers, having fought kind of Putin with oligarchs in the 90s. So I knew all those lawyers. So I said, we're going to divide the world for you personally into green, UK would be safe, red, US would be a no-go. What is yellow? What is Canada or Australia or any of these other places?
Places that would possibly actually enforce like an ICC arrest warrant, something like that.
Right. Or a US warrant. Now, these individuals weren't doing anything wrong according to UK laws. Whereas, later on, SBF and Do Kwon were committing frauds
that's hitting them with kid gloves, David. Come on.
Yeah,
I mean, there's you want to talk about a shell game? I mean, that's
yeah. But these people weren't doing that. So I said, okay, you stay out of jail so they can't Spitzer you, and you have your corporate people negotiate and change your businesses so that you're in compliance with these new laws. Now, those who followed that strategy sat there and bought for pennies on the dollar their rivals who didn't follow that strategy. So when I saw Mark Zuckerberg stand in front of Congress and start talking about Libra, I thought, I've seen this movie before.
Yeah. That was a pretty bad testimony. I mean,
And so that was hence I said, if you're a founder in an emerging industry, you should really take care. And I mean, the online gamers, they were poking the Vegas bear. Blockchain, crypto is poking the sovereign bears.
different animals, but both still have claws.
Correct.
Yeah. What was it? Oh, Dustin Moskowitz was the guy's name who I was thinking of. He was one of the first Facebook founders, and I believe he expatriated from the U.S. right before.
Eduardo Saverin.
Oh, no. Eduardo Saverin is different. The guy who I'm thinking of is Dustin Moskowitz.
Yeah, Dustin Moskowitz is not expatriated. Eduardo Saverin did prior to the IPO.
Okay, because I thought
Year before he went. He was a Brazilian, gave up his U.S. citizenship.
Okay.
And then moved to Singapore.
Okay. I'm sorry, I was confusing those two. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You're right. Eduardo Saverin. Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah. But so just kind of getting back to the state of cryptocurrency or Bitcoin today in CBI programs, what do you see as the role that it's playing? I have a few thoughts as to how different governments are looking at it now. And I think a lot of the paradigm is going to shift just because the Trump administration has started taking on a Bitcoin strategic reserve, and it's sort of starting to legitimize cryptocurrency in a sense, where you're having the approval of the ETFs. Was that last like 15 months ago? I believe it was
Mhm.
January of 24.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're seeing financial legacy brand institutions moving into this field. So, I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about cryptocurrency and how it plays into the citizenship or residency by investment?
Sure. So let's look at it from the individual's point of view first. Second residences and citizenships are important tools to have in your toolbox for personal security. Likewise, you should have access to have money. It's all very nice to have a residence permit to live in Portugal, but if you don't have the money to live,
Right. If you don't have an off ramp.
you don't have an offer. You don't have the. So if you get debanked somewhere, or you come from a jurisdiction which has currency controls, sanctions, etc. So having monies available to you, or and in the form of Bitcoin, is much better. Or you get stuck with a currency which is extensively devalued. You want to have something, just in the old days that would be gold bars. Crypto is an important part of that personal thing. I see now, just if we draw an analogy to that online gaming industry, crypto is now going into another stage of regulation and acceptance. And so again, I think you're going to see things. It'll be interesting. I think the case that I would watch the closest is on the stable coins and Tether, and the US being the big potential regulatory 800-pound gorilla. With the change, with Gary Gensler being gone and the Trump administration coming in, I think you're going to see less regulation by enforcement and more of kind of, this is what's on side and this is what's offside. And so just a clearer line, which will then allow people to operate in this space more closely. I mean, there has been some pretty big stretches, going after developers of mixers, for example, like Tornado Cash. That was pretty much a stress. That's kind of like going after a pen manufacturer because somebody used the pen to do a bank robbery note.
Sure. If I can interject real quick here. So, my previous role before, or in my career, before I made a career change and went to law school and got involved with citizenship by investment, was I worked for 12 years as a U.S. federal civil servant in Washington, D.C. and New York, primarily working in immigration policy work. But the last 2 years, I worked for Homeland Security investigations,
Mm-hmm.
basically always in a writer editor role, but I was reviewing criminal analysis basically on when HSI would arrest someone or someone was charged with something. There were these documents that were produced that basically summarized what the charges were, what the USC was, and, the background of it. And there were two particular cases. I don't have an NDA or anything like that, so I'm, not saying anything that I'm not allowed to. But there was one case where there was a seizure of a Russian oligarch. His yacht was seized in the Dominican Republic. And then there was another case where that pertained to, what's his name? Roman. I'm blanking on his last name.
Amovich?
Yes, but it pertained to Tornado Cash. And I remember looking at um, these reports at different instances when they would come across my desk. And I always raised an eyebrow and I was like, how are you going after someone who's just writing code? That, I mean, is a constitutionally protected aspect under the US First Amendment. I don't understand. You can make the argument that OFAC was overexerting their authority, which clearly they were. I am curious your thoughts on something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that Tornado Cash case that's the one that struck me, and I think I've been quoted and written. I don't know. I think I was just quoted on it at the time. I thought that was a pretty big stretch. OFAC, again, Tornado Cash or any mixer or Monero or any of these particular types of tools could be used for nefarious purposes, or not. But that's true of computers or cars or any tool. To try to make the stretch that you are creating a specific tool for a specific nefarious purpose. I mean, if you're manufacturing I don't know, a specific thing to do safe cracking, maybe, but then again, people, then you would blame every locksmith who opens up a lock because you lost your keys. Uh, so I thought that was a real stretch. And it'll be interesting to see, given the current, we're recording this, I think, 1 week or so after the famous meeting in the Oval Office between President Trump and Zelensky, as to what the future is on OFAC, or foreign corrupt officials legislation, under the current administration. So my view is that this is a new tool that could be used for a variety of purposes. And it took officials, particularly those who are criminal minded, who come at we're going to assume they're going to be used for nefarious purposes as a starting point, prove that they're
Basically, like
not.
the Elizabeth Warrens of the world that assume that just because you're using cryptocurrency, you must be up to no good.
Correct.
Yeah.
And, and it's the same people who could, why do you want privacy? If you're not doing anything bad, why would you want privacy? Well,
Same reason why I
Instead-
put curtains up in my house.
well, whereas the U.S. Constitution and most everything from the Magna Carta forward kind of goes from I assume I'm innocent until proven otherwise.
That's fair enough, but I mean, just to take this aggressive approach. For example, I'm not sure if you are aware, in New York City, they used to have a policy of stop and frisk was the term they used, and basically it gave police, without even having reasonable suspicion, the ability to stop individuals, pat them down, and without having to provide any reason or explanation as to why the individual was stopped, what they were suspected of, or what they were thought to have committed. When you start giving the state those kind of broad sweeping powers from a law enforcement standpoint, and that's just on an everyday level, your civil liberties just erode exponentially. I mean, because it's only a matter of time until something like that, like due process, access to legal representation, or an expedited trial, something like that, until those things are out the window as well. That's a very good point.
It's a slippery slope.
Absolutely. But just to kind of circle back, are there any jurisdictions that you see being more favorable to cryptocurrency? I mean, I know that there are, for example, Vanuatu and Antigua and Barbuda will take cryptocurrency straight away as a form of payment. But do you see any of these other jurisdictions being open to taking cryptocurrency as for payment of government services? Or do you think a lot of that comes from pressure from places like the US, mostly like the Treasury Department, and within Europe, the ECB?
I think the reason why a lot of countries have not yet adopted anything from payment of taxes or a fee for, we'll leave El Salvador aside for a moment, is because of the volatility of the currency. Whereas if you're setting a budget and you're trying to say we have some type of benchmark currency, whether that's a euro or a US dollar or sterling or Eastern Caribbean dollar, which is tied to the US dollar. When you're setting a budget, you're predicting ahead of the year, we need X number of this, whatever fiat.
Of course.
And the problem is if you say we're going to say it's 100 Bitcoin,
Right.
you don't know what that's going to be on the day in August when that hits. And then you've got a question. So I think that's a major barrier for people. So I will see, that's one thing. The second thing is source of funds.
I was going to ask about that as well.
Yeah. And so when you're doing a review and you don't, as a jurisdiction, it's in their best interest not to let kind of what we'll call bad apples into the barrel. And because it because their local voters don't want that, and the local voters will vote them out. And other jurisdictions, I think, and I've written quite extensively, I think the EU and other jurisdictions are quite unfair and out and really stretching to say that residence and citizenship by investments are used for money laundering and crime, etc.
I'll just interject real quick. I mean,
Yeah.
those kind of institutions are just beholden to the Fed. I mean, and that's a whole nother ball game. That's just one bureaucracy beholden to another. It's not an issue of autonomy to a certain extent, but it's about one institution presiding over another and being able through economic or political means to exert themselves on the other entity.
Yeah, and Adam, you and I have gone through law school, so we learned the term ultra vires,
Yes.
beyond the power. And that was certainly what Brussels was doing with Malta. It was just beyond their powers to do that. But I think you will see as you start to get stable coins, as you start to get other things, you will see more jurisdictions adopt. For example, they may not say Bitcoin, but they may say a certain number of tether. And that's the point of a stable coin. And that solves the volatility issue on a budgeting.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that is definitely one way forward, but I don't think it's so much necessarily about the volatility. I think it's the hesitation to basically sort of break from their economic restrictions. As I told you before we started recording, I was speaking to a former prime minister today, and we were talking about the role of the ECB within their country. And, I made a comment, something to the effect of, well, why doesn't your country accept crypto? I mean, and the comment essentially was what you mentioned, where you mentioned El Salvador. So both this country and El Salvador are kind of in a similar situation, and I'll explain what I mean. El Salvador took on the US dollar back in the 80s when Civil War kicked off, right? So it adopted the US dollar to basically hedge off inflation. And it's still on the US dollar today. Simultaneously, back in 2021, they adopted Bitcoin as legal tender. Okay, great. Well, they're still beholden to the US Treasury and their financial policies and how that affects their currency because they're unable to print their own money. So they're at the mercy of the US in that sense. My conversation with the prime minister was, well, look, you guys are essentially just beholden to Frankfurt and what the ECB says because you're not allowed to legally accept other currencies. But what about concurrently accepting it for like government services? And due to political reasons, I think there was a hesitation to actually ruffle any feathers, if you will. That seems to me what the hesitation is that regardless of where the jurisdiction is for a lot of these citizenship by investment countries, they're beholden to other institutions that are either controlling their visa free access or in some other way. It turns into a political, geopolitical kind of game in a sense. I'm just curious to what you think about that angle.
I think those are barriers for the countries. But if we're looking at it from the individual, if they say it's, X number of Bitcoin for El Salvador, or it's going to be specific government fee for another jurisdiction, the client can take part of can liquidate and turn into fiat whatever they need to get the citizenship. That's how they acquire that tool. But it's still important to have, excuse my French, to protect both your ass and your assets,
Of course.
both the fire insurance of a second residence or citizenships, and also to have a variety of currencies, whether that's crypto, various fiat currencies, precious metals, whatever,
I completely agree.
stores of value.
Yeah, I also just wanted to mention, I noticed that in some of your work, you were using the term fire escape plan.
Yes.
Okay. I have seen everyone almost beat this term like a dead horse, a plan B, blah, 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 blah. And it's the first time I've actually heard an original term, a fire escape plan. And I read that in one of your articles and I was like, it's nail on the head. I mean,
Yeah.
it's absolutely spot on for the term that should be applied.
Well, I've been using this analogy, which is a little cheeky for a Canadian to use for an American audience. But I tell my clients, you live in a political wildfire zone.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, there's a variety of concerns from mass shootings to, I grew up when Detroit was Murder City, but then it was two drug dealers shooting at each other with Saturday night specials. Now you have people with, with bump stocks, automatic weapons, walking into places of worship and schools and bowling alleys and movie theaters. A great amount rise political violence, political polarization. Basically, if you are politically active in the US, the other half of the country doesn't like you. And some of those people are extreme and those people are armed. So, and, when you mentioned Elizabeth Warren, and her Billionaire Tax Act, there was a case that came to the Supreme Court called Moore.
Yes, this was on, correct me if I'm wrong, it was from the Trump tax cuts, and it was the people who had been accumulating
Guilty tax.
guilty tax. Okay.
So the question was the constitutionality of, and in this case, it was unrealized income, but it was going to unrealized gain. Well, Justice Kavanaugh, who wrote the decision in that case, kind of kicked the can down the road. And so you had Biden, and then as replaced by Harris, pushing forth a tax, ultra millionaire tax. Well, no, that Warren was the ultra millionaire, and Biden was the billionaire tax, which he quickly redefined as 100 millionaire, which was taxation of unrealized gain. Now, bringing it into crypto, we have within a week a very important case, the Roger Ver case.
I actually wanted to talk to you about that, but we'll circle back. Please go ahead.
Okay, so we can talk about it now.
Let's absolutely talk about it.
Okay, so Roger Ver is an interesting character. And
If I can interject real quick, I'll just
sure.
For everyone, if you're listening to a podcast called the Bitcoin Lawyer Podcast, please educate yourself. Roger Ver, aka Bitcoin Jesus, expatriated from the US back in 2014, obtained St. Kitts and Nevis citizenship by investment, and subsequently moved out of the US. He was arrested last April in Barcelona on trumped up tax charges for failing to report unrealized capital gains after he had subsequently renounced US citizenship, but still was operating two US LLCs at the time. So the timeline, I believe, was up to 2017. He was operating these two US registered LLCs, and then there was sort of a commingling or alleged commingling of personal and business assets of cryptocurrency. And the IRS is claiming, I believe it's $48 million dollar failure to pay and unrealized capital gains as part of the exit tax. I think I got all that.
Yeah, no, you got it right. So we'll leave aside for a moment. People have very strong feelings one way or another about Roger Ver as a person. We'll leave aside, innocent till proven guilty or guilty not. The interesting part of this case for my purposes is part of the expatriation tax regime, specifically section the so-called exit tax. Now, when you give up your US citizenship, if you trigger any one of these three tests under something called on Form 4, which is, do you have the day before you renounce your citizenship or give up your long-term green card, do you have more than 2 million in worldwide assets? Roger Ver clearly did. The second test is looking at your federal tax paid over the previous 5 years. Is that greater than a particular average? So it's a little over 190,000 every year. It rises with inflation each year. The third thing is, are you unable to certify your your U.S. tax compliance for the previous 5 years.
Okay, right.
If you trigger any of those, and Roger Ver obviously triggered the net worth at the time he renounced his citizenship, you are what's called a covered expatriate.
Correct.
What that means is that you are subject to an exit tax under 877A it's a mark to market. We'll leave pensions and some of the other things. There's 4 different parts, but we'll stick with assets. So they would say, okay, Mr. Veer, you acquired your Bitcoins at this price, your cost basis.
Yeah.
The value of Bitcoin the day before you renounce was this. What's the unrealized gain? And that would define under 877A a tax bill, a capital gains rate. The interesting part of this case is his lawyers specifically argued that 877A as a section of the code is unconstitutional because it's taxing unrealized gains.
Yeah.
So it's an expansion of the Moore case.
Right.
So they're looking to have the case dismissed because if the tax is unconstitutional, therefore Mr. Veer can't be charged with evading an unconstitutional tax.
Of course. Yeah.
Now it's going to go from in Los Angeles at the court of first instance. It will make its way through the system circuit. We won't bore it.
I believe it's the Central District in the Ninth Circuit
Yeah.
in California.
So it'll make its way through the circuits, and eventually this will get to SCOTUS, Supreme Court, to SCOTUS. How long that will take? Be a few years. So we're all waiting for the first. It's an argument, as one of my law professors would say. It's an argument. It's only a good argument if a court accepts it.
Fair enough.
So we'll see if he's got at least a lower court saying it's a good argument. Whatever way it goes, it's going to be appealed because of the stakes for both the government and for Roger Ver. So it's a case worth watching from a tax point of view and would be very important for anybody who's considering expatriating, but who is hesitating to do so because they do not have the liquidity to pay the exit tax.
I think that's becoming more and more of an issue. The more people that I've talked to, and I mean, the price of Bitcoin is down. I think today it was hovering right around 80,000 US, 81,000. But 3 weeks ago, it was hovering around 100,000 US. A lot of people, they see a 20% drop and they're kind of trying to time the market. The issue is, well, what if I submit? And this happened, what was it, the summer of 2023 or 2024? I'm forgetting. When was the MOA signed between the 5 Caribbean before the price went up? Is that 2023? And this thing, especially with, you had mentioned before, price volatility, you're never going to beat the market. That obviously does kind of worry some people. And I would absolutely agree with you. Trying to at least get an application in or gather your documents. Don't wait until a program is closed. I think it was 2 years ago when St. Kitts, they had discounted their citizenship by investment to 125,000 and then put it at 250 again, which it was at before the hurricane sale, if you will.
I'm often asked by clients, what do you think? Do you think the price is going to go down? Everybody hopes the price will go down. And I can say, well, the only thing I can predict is next year is going to be different than this year. It rarely goes down. And if so, temporarily because of things like a hurricane or some emergency. Programs open and close. I can't tell you how many times over the years when I've had clients come back 2 or 3 years later say, okay, I'm ready to go. Well, that program closed a year and a half ago or increased in price, etc. So if somebody is into crypto and they're thinking about potentially expatriating, they need to get the tool of a second citizenship in hand. They don't need to expatriate that moment. Then having that in place, they should do some planning. So, for example, one of the things is you have what's called a unified credit, a gift or estate tax credit, which allows you to gift assets up to, and that again increases, and we're going to assume that the Trump tax cuts will continue. So you're over $14 million. Well, if that gets you below the 2 million mark,
Yeah.
you're not a covered expatriate, you don't have an exit tax. But the timing of that is important. You need to do that gift in the year prior to the expatriation. Likewise, if you expatriated in Q1, let's say it's in 2025, you define your tax bill, but you don't pay that bill until the following April.
Right.
So if you've got a chance to get the liquidity in place to pay that tax bill when you actually have to pay it. So this becomes important when you've got things like a big liquidity event, like IPO, or you've got a merger, a buyer, or you've got a very volatile asset. I mean, so the lead time to, I call it making dinner reservations, which is a renunciation appointment, is going to be at least a month to 6 weeks. That's if you're willing to get on a plane and go to where we're going to find where we can get you. So your market timing is going to be, 6 weeks is a long time in the world of crypto volatility.
Yeah, absolutely.
So market timing is kind of difficult, but it's at least manageable. So if you need to have kind of a strategy and really understand this stuff. And unfortunately, I have to say some of the advice I see out there is like, not good.
One thing I have a policy about is I will never publicly denounce someone personally. I will never name check people or say things.
I'm not going to name check anybody, but I think
Certain people are litigious and
Mhm.
and I do try to,
Yeah,
at least
I
be
understand.
aware of that. But there is definitely a lot of, as you call them, bad actors in this industry. And yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's one of my partners sent to me a TikTok, and it was a kind of a funny thing about a German guy who comes to the U.S. and oh, this is great. There's so many, and then he starts like overeating and then put pillows in his, his
I know
shirt.
exactly who you're talking about. I've seen that guy on YouTube. Yeah, he has really funny videos. I don't know his name.
And at the end, he comes, goes back to Germany and then gets a knock on the door by a guy playing the IRS, and he talks about, oh, we got this tax, which is wrong. And then he says, and we're going to tax you for 10 years.
Yep.
Well, the 10-year rule died in 2008. That was 17 years ago. But that misinformation is still out there. I still hear lots of Americans say, well, I lost my US citizenship when I became, or I lost my foreign citizenship when I became an American. Look at my petition. Yes, it does say language that you are pledging allegiance to the United States and you are renouncing allegiance to elsewhere. But let me show you the Foreign Affairs Manual.
Do you have a
It says,
certificate of loss of nationality
yeah,
from?
if you don't have a certificate of lost nationality, and another classic is, I'm not a green card holder anymore. My permanent resident card expired. To which I respond, do you think you lost your citizenship when your passport expired?
Right.
No,
Yeah.
you're still a green card holder, which for tax purposes means you're a US person for tax purposes.
That is an interesting, like, I'm just thinking, I do want to circle back to the Roger Ver case, but
Sure.
like you just mentioned that just brings up another idea. I'll come back to that. But I wanted to circle back to the Roger Ver case. So I mean, like with the parameters of the case that we talked about, I'm curious to what you think if, and again, this is all speculation, right? Do you think that President Trump will give Roger Ver a pardon like he did with Ross Ulbright?
They're really kind of different cases.
Correct.
And so Ross Halbert,
Really seems like a quid pro quo for the libertarian vote, in my opinion. That's really what it seems like.
yeah, I have more sympathy for Ross Halbridge, for Roger Ver. It happened to be Bitcoin. It could have been widgets or Apple shares or whatever. Yeah. It just happened to be crypto. So it comes down to the facts on his case. But the more interesting thing for me for the Ver case is the constitutionality question. And here, he's brought it to the sticking point. And whether, you like or dislike Roger Ver, often bad facts make good law. So it's really that it's brought the constitutionality of 877A, which is, there's been lots of literature and had lots of discussions with many kind of U.S. legal scholars about this issue for a long time. And so this is this is where it's going to get precedence is going to be set.
I honestly think at this point that my personal situation is a little different. Being an American, having worked for the US government, but not attending law school in the US, I can only kind of look at it and talk about US law from a layman standpoint rather than from a legal standpoint. But I think that the court, as it's currently constructed, is going to be extremely hesitant to pass any kind of actual decision on the constitutionality of taxing unrealized capital gains, because that just brings up a whole host of questions that, and obviously this was raised during the campaign last year, where, well, what happens if you pay 1 year and then the asset depreciates? Do you get a refund? Like, how's that going to work? Right? I mean, like, it gets into this whole sort of like credits and uh minuses or credits and debits. It's a ridiculous notion just to begin with from an accounting standpoint. And I'm not even an accountant, but I just think that it would create such a world of problems for accountants.
Well, generally wealth taxes are, so 877A is what's called an exit tax. It's a realization and it's a one-time thing. Wealth taxes, I just had this discussion with somebody this morning. So in the UK, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is their finance minister, brought in a budget and made some major changes to something called the non-dom remittance basis. The UK has this weird kind of year end, it's April 5th, as opposed to kind of a calendar year. And so I've been busy getting non-doms to leave the UK. And this is very predictable. And so not only are they not going to see the windfall, they're going to see a dramatic hit to their annual tax collections. And so people are screaming, bring in a wealth tax. And the UK is one of the few major developed countries which doesn't have an exit tax.
Correct.
And so if I either saw the light or went to the dark side and started working for the minister, I would say you should consider bringing in a exit tax as opposed to a wealth tax.
Right.
Here's why.
Yeah.
For a wealth tax, let's say we've got Adam and David PLC. I'm going to put a valuation on that, and it's up to the tax authorities, HMRC in the case of the UK, to challenge that. But we're going to do that every year. Do they have the bandwidth to challenge it every year?
I see.
And if Adam and David PLC drops in value next year, I'm going to get a refund. So wealth taxes are very difficult to administer and are always subject to having to give it back should the assets drop in value next year.
Yeah.
Whereas an exit tax,
It's a one-time.
it's a one-time, and I'll put the valuation. HMRC says, well, we can challenge it, so we're only going to do this once. And if Adam and David PLC drops in value next year, that's our problem. And so that's why countries have brought in and kept exit taxes, but brought in and got rid of wealth taxes.
Yeah. I know that historically France got rid of their exit tax, or not their exit, but their wealth tax. And there was an argument. I remember I was watching a documentary on Richard Branson, and he actually bought Necker Island in the British Virgin Islands when he was super young. He was like 27 or 28. And he's been a resident domiciled in BVI since then. I've always just kind of chuckled. I'm like, yeah, that's how you earn your money. You just become domiciled. Or you become tax non-resident outside the country. Keep the passport, like you said. Just play the delta, and to your advantage.
Yeah, when net equals gross, it's easier to accumulate wealth.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's interesting, but all these solutions really have to be livable. So I'll occasionally get a client who says, look, I've been sued, I've been audited, I've gone through a divorce, move me somewhere with no taxes and no lawyers. So I said, no problem, we'll move you to Pitcairn Island. Only 37 people on earth have decided that's where they want to live. And they go, oh, no, I want airports and restaurants and museums and schools and whatever. So we end up moving to what are thought of as high tax countries, but on a lower control tax basis. So As the UK is chasing out all these ultra high net worths, countries like Italy are saying, we'll give you a better tax deal. And so, or Ireland or Malta or Cyprus or Greece or Switzerland or Portugal, these jurisdictions say, okay, well, if Adam is going to move from the UK to Italy, there's no marginal cost to having Adam. It's not like we have to pave another mile of road or hire another police officer. And we're going to get, it used to be 100, they upped it last summer to 200,000 euros out of it
Oh, for their flat tax, right?
for the flat tax. Now, from Italy's point of view, they go, well, that's 8 to 9 times what the average person pays in tax. There's no marginal cost. Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, when Adam gets up in the morning and has a cappuccino or espresso, he's going to pay 23% VAT tax on that.
Is that what the VAT in Italy is? Is 23?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, but there's VAT tax.
Yeah, of course.
And, he's going to buy a property and rent that, and maybe hire some people. And so there's no marginal cost to having him there. He's a revenue generator.
Yeah, of
And
course.
he's going to cover himself and other people. Now, from your point of view, if you're an ultra high net worth, when it was 100,000, I had a client and I said, this deal, and he goes, 100,000, that's why I pay my accountants every year. There's no compliance cost. Whether you make $1 or 100 million, it's either 100 now, 2,000. Okay. And I don't have to worry about, is this a business dinner? Should I buy or lease? Have I got all the receipts? And for the more wealthy people who have very complex tax returns, when they get their return from their accountant and they said, okay, sign here, and they're going, I hope you got this right because I'm liable. Whereas if tax becomes a line item, that's great. And you'll hear people say, well, it's a race to the bottom. Italy has said, well, we're not going to charge zero because there will be some, there's not a benefit to us, but gee, we'll cap it. And they originally thought it was 100,000, and they realized, hey, we got a lot of takers at 100. They raised the price to 200. They have a lot of takers.
Absolutely.
And Greece has said, we'll keep ours at 100. And then the original lump sum jurisdiction, which is Switzerland, well, the amounts vary depending on which canton you're in. And yeah, so it's a race to equilibrium. So some jurisdictions are chasing people out, and some are attracting them, the golden geese.
Got it. I just want to be a little respectful of time. So I kind of wanted to just touch on one topic as we close this out that you've written on recently. We haven't mentioned. I wanted to discuss Trump's gold card with you. I've seen quite a bit of things you've mentioned and written on in the last, what was it, 10 days ago? Was it last Wednesday, last Tuesday? Something along those lines, right? So I wanted one to get your opinion of just general high level thoughts, and then your thoughts if the US actually does enter the citizenship by investment game, what you think that does to the industry. So I don't know if you can touch on those 2 points.
Sure. So the gold card is a citizenship, is a residence by investment. So US, of course, already has the EB-5 program. And again, I act on behalf of the clients as opposed to a country or a fund manager or a developer, etc. So I will often get approached by foreigners who want some access to the US. They say, get me a green card. I say, well, let's step back for a moment. What are you trying to accomplish here? Well, I want my daughter to go to Stanford, my son to go to MIT. I want access to hopefully someday grandkids and children. I want to do some investments in the US. I may want to have a vacation home somewhere. That's great. So, okay, we can accomplish, how much time are you going to spend in the US?
Right.
And so we can say, we can accomplish your goals. The kids can come into the US. We'll put them on a track to getting a green card. They'll be US persons. They're going to get careers in the U.S., which they would pay U.S. tax on anyway. So there are no tax lawyers have their own Hippocratic oath, which is pay no further tax.
I like that. I've never heard that.
Yeah, generation one will have access without exposing the family wealth. They say, well, I feel uncomfortable on a B1, B2. Okay, so we can get you an L, some other type of non-immigrant visa, you could stay 100% of the time, but you're going to choose to spend enough time to either not trigger the substantial presence test, or if you do, be able to take a treaty election or a closer connection. So we could, with proper planning, have you be 4 or 5 months physically in the US without exposing the family wealth. So the EB5 isn't particularly, the first thing that everybody reaches to. Okay, but let's say that they want to come in. Now, one of the major features that was announced for the gold card, now we'll compare the Trump gold card proposal with the existing EB5, is they've said, well, we're going to tax the gold card members only have to pay tax on US source and US situs, territorial taxation.
This was an issue that when I first heard it, I was like, okay, I don't think they even know what they're talking about. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes. Well, in order to change that, remembering back in our earlier conversation, who's a US person for tax purposes? Citizen, green card holder, substantial presence. They would have to not only change the immigration legislation, they would have to change the tax code, which can't be done under reconciliation.
Or by EO.
Or it's definitely not by EO. And actually will require, and is going to be subject to filibuster and all those other things. So not only do you have to get every Republican on side, you got to get some Democrats. So it's dead on arrival. Now, if you don't have that advantage of the gold card versus the EB5, what advantage can you offer that'll justify 6.2 times the cost? And we're assuming that's assuming that it's not a sunk cost, that it's a straight up donation as opposed to an investment. But let's assume they're equal. It's still 6.2 times. We can say, okay, well, speed of processing. Well, if you want to get to the US earlier, we can combine that EB5 with one of those non-immigrant visas.
I saw something the other day that the EB5 has like a 900-day backlog right now. Oh, okay. I get depends on the country.
Yeah, because they have country quotas. But even if you're in one of the longer ones, so for example, a China or an India,
I think it was China specifically that had the 900 days. Yeah.
you can get access to the US sooner and be sleeping in the United States by combining your EB5 with one of the other, it depends whether it's E1 or E2, depends on what country you're talking about, because they have to be a treaty nation. But you can do L1s for if they've got the fact situation O's. L1 is kind of the common one that we use. So we can solve that. So, okay, Trump gold card doesn't have that advantage. Well, the only other thing that they can offer is we're not going to go through the source of funds examination that we do for EB5. Well, that kind of is contrary to the we're not going to let any bad apples in. So I was on speaking to a journalist today, and he said, okay, what target market do they have? I go, none. And, Trump was talking about employers trying to get, hotshot employees. Well, if you want to get a hotshot employee, there's lots of different ways of bringing them in rather than paying $5 million.
Yeah, or I would say that there's plenty of markets outside the United States where you can get hotshot employees that will work for a third or even less than what a prevailing US wage is.
Or if you want to have them in Silicon Valley, and let's say you've got a top student from an Indian engineering university or a top Chinese student, here's a trick. Get them work permit and then permanent residence in a Canadian subsidiary. They can do the Zoom or Teams calls. They can get, when they're Chinese with a work permit or Canadian permanent residence, they'll be able to get B1, B2 to fly down to San Francisco for those, twice a month meetings. They'll eventually get Canadian citizenship, and you can bring them in permanently under a TN visa.
I see. Okay. That's a transfer visa, right?
That's a treaty national visa.
Oh, treaty national. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So there's lots of different ways of skinning the cat if you look at it from the client's point of view as opposed to the country's point of view or from the salesperson's point of view.
So, I mean, based on sort of the initial announcement, based on, the things they outlined, do you actually see this thing getting off the ground? Because I can tell you, I worked in DC during the first Trump administration, and there were constantly things that were announced, policy changes that never came to fruition. And I see this again. I haven't been working for the US government for now 18 months. It was September 23 when I left. But looking at this now, I'm like, there's so much just like pomp and circumstance that like, oh, we're gonna get it. Everyone will come in, they'll pay all the taxes. I'm like, this is completely anti-intuitive to how people maintain their wealth. They don't move to a country to pay a lot of tax on purpose. So I'm just curious, do you think that there's any merit to this program, or is it DOA like you said?
A journalist came up with a great response when I told him these things. He goes, "Yeah, this is this term's infrastructure week."
Okay. Yeah, might be.
So I think you've heard, a big proposal. You heard a little bit of commentary about it in the, we'll call it State of the Union address. But I think we're going to, as the practicalities of this are first purveyed to Mr. Lutnick and then on to Mr. Trump, you will see them talked about less and less. It's a bit like birthright citizenship. You may think that that you shouldn't have birthright citizenship. Okay, you've got to change the Constitution, which means that you've got to get super majorities in both houses, and you've got to get, certain, yeah, and stuff. And so, what was the last one that was attempted? Well, the ERA. And how long did it take to get those states? 42 years.
Oh, yeah. And a lot of
And
states didn't even ratify it until like recently, if I remember right.
right. And then the argument was you had to get those states within a certain time period and you exceeded that time period. So you may not like the 14th Amendment, but you've got to, you got to go through some effort. It's more than just picking up the Sharpie.
I've already spoken politics today on another episode, so I don't really want to get into that now. But I mean, there's definitely a lot of posturing that I see, and it's like, oh, we're gonna get this, it'll be so easy, and then you're like, yeah, but it still needs to go through a court, and you're not a king. I mean, it just like I scratch my head. I'm like, this guy is surrounded by lawyers all the time, spent the last 2 years in and out of court. You think you would learn after a while just to excuse my language, but just to shut your mouth sometimes. Like someone would just kind of take you aside, even if you're the president, and just be like, "Hey, look, maybe don't be so braggadocious about this or that."
Well, I have the advantage of being a Canadian, so I don't have a dog in this fight.
Fair
I can't
enough.
vote Republican or Democrat.
Right.
My first wife accused me of looking at the world like Mr. Spock. She thought it was without emotion
Right.
and an insult. I took it as untrue but complimentary in that I look at the world logically and how it is as opposed to how I think it should be. And so when I, look at these kinds of proposals or any these things, I try to look at it from a logical, will this actually work point of view. And with the Trump gold card, I just laid out why I don't think it'll work because the legislative hurdles are just too enormous.
Absolutely. Yeah. I left the US a year and a half ago and have zero intent on moving back. It's just become too tumultuous, too divisive about things, and I definitely understand what you mean. I have a lot of Canadian friends here, and they're I'm forgetting the stat, but it's something like 85% of Canadians live within 30 kilometers of the US border, or 50
The,
kilometers.
the one I always hear is 90% within 100 kilometers.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
that's what it is. But I mean, like, there's a reason why, because of the economic opportunities, but it must be nice just to kind of sit there on the sides, get a tub of popcorn and settle in. You're like, okay, this doesn't affect us.
Well, if you look at the map, Windsor, where I grew up, is actually south of Detroit.
Yeah,
So
there's always those little anomalies. Like there's this one town that's just north of Minnesota that's actually cut off from the US. Like you actually have to drive into Canada and clear Canadian customs and then clear US customs to get to it.
Yeah. Well, we always used to joke that we get the cold weather coming down from the States.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's fair enough. I'll just go ahead and close this out, David. Do you have any predictions, any words of wisdom, or any final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with about any of the topics that we've covered? I mean, we've covered quite a plethora of topics. If you have any final thoughts or any summary of anything you'd like to share.
Well, I think the importance of diversifying your passport portfolio and along with your asset portfolio is very important because we're living in interesting times, which is both a curse and an opportunity. And if you want to be able to negate the potential negatives and take advantage of all the positives, then I think exploring things like cryptocurrencies along with alternate residences is really important. And one of the things that I was taught as a child was the world is a certain way. It's going to be a certain way. The sun's going to rise in the morning. Some people will vote for a politician who says, I'm going to stop the sun from rising. They're going to be disappointed. Some people are going to put on suntan lotion, which is a temporary
Yeah, you're just putting
barrier.
a Band-Aid over the
Yeah.
situation.
And some people are going to build solar panels. You have no control over the sun coming up, but you have 100% control over your reaction to that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, my mom always used to tell me when I was a kid how you react, like a situation, it's 90% how you react and 10% circumstance. There's certain factors that are beyond our control, but how you choose to react, and in this industry, how you choose to mitigate your circumstances is entirely on you, the individual.
Chance favors the prepared mind.
Fortune favors the bull as well.
Yep.
So, all right, we'll just leave it at that.
Well,
David?
it's a pleasure talking to you, Adam.
Yeah, you as well, David. Thank you so much for your time, for your insight. I always look forward to reading one of your articles.
Great. Pleasure. I look forward to meeting you in person at some point, Adam. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Bitcoin Lawyer Podcast. For more information, please visit our website at www.bitcoinlawyer.com. And remember, Bitcoin Lawyer is your legal bridge between Bitcoin and freedom.